Hey guys, how you doing? Welcome to my office. If you haven't been here, you should come here. Don't forget office hours. Office hours are Wednesday afternoons, 2:30 to 4 usually. Although today I actually have to stop at 3:30. I'll post that in an announcement. And Monday mornings, 10:30 till noon. So basically after class. So if you ever want to come by, you're welcome to come by. So I didn't quite get through the three lectures that I wanted to get through for chapter one. And once again, this is I'm going to try to make sure I don't try to pack too much into stuff going forward. But the idea of this video is just to wrap up, just to hit those last few slides. So we had gotten to this slide, the cognitive revolution, in class. So I'm just going to kind of take over from here and wrap up the chapter one slides. All right, so where I'm at here is, let's do this just a very quick kind of story so far, I guess. So we talked about, psychology kind of pursuing all the way up to Hermann von Ebbinghaus with his studies of memory and how everybody was trying to be very scientific in their approach. And then we said enter Sigmund Freud, this guy that was not a scientist and didn't really approach things scientifically, and yet somehow managed to just kind of almost take over the field of psychology. Everybody thought psychology was what Freud did. And the scientific part of the psychology community was not real happy about that. And so I talked about some of the reactions. And again, look at the dates we're in, sort of early 1900s, just sort of before the war, if you will. And I said in Europe, the reactions to some of Freud's ideas was to kind of, two reactions. One was to retreat back into the study of more basic perception kinds of things, like how information from the real world is represented in the mind, but also this reaction to Freud's focus on sex and aggression by kind of a counter reaction that said, no, there's way more cool stuff about humans that we should be studying, and we should be studying the good things that make humans especially interesting or especially cool. Things like our ability to be creative and come up with creative solutions. And so we talked about the brick test as a way of measuring creativity. That general area was called humanistic psychology. So Europe kind of retreat to perception plus this humanistic thing, whereas in North America, the reaction was one that we call behaviorism. Some of the major figures of behaviorism here. We're going to talk about all these guys in some detail when we get to the chapter. There's a whole chapter on essentially behaviorism. So I just throw up the pictures now. But the critical point I wanted to make there is the behaviorists were trying to be ultra scientific. And so that was the reaction of Freud was, no, real psychologists don't talk about things that you cannot directly measure, directly see. And so they kind of redefine psychology to be about the association between stimuli and responses, SR psychology, as some people call it. And so they sort of restricted the scope of what they considered part of what psychologists should do, but they also collected a lot of data and learned a lot. So this was an interesting era of psychology. It did kind of chain psychology in. There were certain things you could study and certain things you couldn't study. Okay, this form of psychology was very strong, but started to become eroded a little bit more in the 1960s, and that's where we were. And there were a couple of things that I wanted to highlight about the 1960s. And so I did a little bit about this in class, but let me kind of sort of take over again from here. One of them I mentioned was computers existed. So we invented computers, and computers were these devices that could take input and transform it in certain ways and produce output. So in some ways they became a sort of model. Sorry, somebody's at the door, so I'm going to answer. A sort of model for how we do things. Sorry, were we doing something right now? I'll pause right now. Sorry, go on. I can undo this. I just pause. I've never paused lecturing halfway through and resumed again, but there it is. I might just keep that in. Maybe I'll edit it out. We'll see. I think I know what I was talking about, though. So I was just mentioning that with the advent of the computer, we suddenly had this analogy to ourselves, in a sense. We had built this device that kind of does some of what the brain seems to do. And in so doing, we gained this way of thinking about ourselves, kind of like how, you know, the solar system inspired thoughts about atoms and such. Computers really inspired and affected the way we thought about our mind. We had a really concrete example of things like memory and input devices and output devices and things like that. And so, yeah, that was one part of psychologists starting to think, well, maybe these things can be studied. You know, maybe we should be talking about these things in between. There was also, I didn't mention this in class, but I'm going to go over here too. There were other forces that were providing money, to be blunt, to researchers if they would study some of these other things that behaviorists wouldn't study. So what I'm showing you over here is a guy looking at an old school radar kind of display. And I don't know if you've seen these, but it's a little line that sweeps around, and anytime there's, let's say, ships in the area or something, it'll do a little blip on the radar. And so this person's job is to watch these blips, and especially to look for surprising or unexpected ones. So for example, if a bomber started coming in, an airplane started flying in, then suddenly this blip might show up on the, you know, outside of the radar and start coming towards where the boat is. And it's this guy's job to detect that and to say, oh, we got an incoming bogey, something's going on, and then we can all be ready in case it's an attack. We can be ready to defend. It's a hard job to stare at one of these things going round and round, waiting for some unusual thing to happen that almost never happens. It requires something we call sustained attention, being able to attend and sustain your attention for a long period of time. And what the Army found is people aren't very good at that. And they wanted to know what they could do to make people better. So they started to become interested in things like attention. And they started to say, hey, we'll provide money for researchers who want to study things like that. Okay, so that kind of led us to the point where I ended the class, the whole invisible animal notion, where I was just trying to give you that sense that if you allow an invisible animal into a classroom full of people, although you may never see the animal, you may ultimately learn a lot about it simply by the reactions it causes in the people and in other things in its environment. Again, I suggested that letting an elephant into the room, for example, would cause very different reactions than letting an invisible rat into the room, for example. And so you could learn a little bit about the size of the animal, you could learn a little bit about the weight of the animal, you could learn a little bit about the speed of the animal. If something, you know, was darting all over the place, you'd see reactions with people all over the place. So you can learn about the invisible thing through the effects it has on things you can see. And that became the sort of model of what we call the cognitive revolution. We are interested in memory. We are interested in attention. We are interested in consciousness. We know we cannot see these things directly, but we can see the effects they have. And so it becomes a more complicated science. I joke about it being the difficult science, but it is the difficult science. And that's the science we do still today. So this cognitive revolution became very strong. We kind of, some people say, broke the chains of behaviorism, and we started to study things behaviorists didn't want us to study, so to speak. Now this led to all sorts of things. Another big area of psychology today is social psychology. Social psychology is even a step further. So the cognitive psychologists are worried about how our mind works and memory, attention, and all that. Social psychology is really interested in how other people affect us and how we affect other people. So how humans affect each other. So it includes topics like prejudice. You know, why are some humans behaving prejudicially towards others? I don't know what this is. Oh, it includes things like the effects the media can have on us, on our notions of beauty, on our notions of physical fitness, on our notions of appropriate behavior. You know, I'll bring up the Donald Trump again. One of the things Donald Trump has done is redefine what's appropriate for somebody in his position to do. When we see this every day and we see the kinds of things he does, that starts to become less shocking and more normal. And so there could be people studying things like that. Peer pressure, why do you do things because certain other people do it? Violence, how do we stop violence? This is a major theme in Toronto now. These would all fall into the social psychology kind of realm. And it's a whole other level of psychology that is now very strong. So I'm just trying to kind of give you a sense of how psychology has evolved, and some of these topics you're going to see in your studies, kind of came, they're relatively recent. So let me make this point that I haven't made clearly enough yet. When we're talking cognitive psychology, we're talking 1960s. That's 50 years ago. Not long. That's your parents. In the time your parents have been alive, we have really just started doing a lot of these cognitive and social experiments. What's cool about that is that it's a young science, and it's a complex science, one that progresses slowly, which means that you guys, any one of you guys, may ultimately make major contributions to this new science. It's not like physics or chemistry where we kind of have a lot of things nailed down and figured out. We don't. It's a very new science where we have a lot of ideas and theories and some data that supports this or that, but a lot of development has to take place. It's like a child of a science. And that, for me, I always found that exciting, that I might actually have an impact on how this science develops, okay, for example. All right, let's just kind of move on a little bit further. This is kind of the world you guys live in. So starting really in the, well, you could say late 80s, especially 90s, and then just sort of picking up speed from there, we have got new tools. I don't know if you remember Wilhelm Wundt's Principles of Physiological Psychology. The first psychology textbook was about physiological psychology, and now we've gone to cognitive and social and all that. There's a really strong push now to get back to the brain. So we have mind and we have brain, right? Mind is kind of the software, it's kind of the thoughts, the feelings, the whatever. Brain is where that all happens. It's the biological matter that somehow gives rise to mind. Some people say mind is what the brain does. Well, we can now measure the brain. We can watch the brain as the mind does things, thanks to new tools. And that is allowing us now to kind of form that connection, kind of see these two things connecting, and understand better how the brain gives rise to the mind and what parts of the brains are involved in certain tasks. So, just to give you a sense, here's like a child with electrodes on their head. You can do these studies. So this would be like EEG, where you're measuring electrical activity in the brain. You can do these studies even with very young children, even children who can't speak. So for example, you could be looking at how their brain is reacting to speech before they can even speak, right? And you could look at whether certain areas, like Broca's area, for example, is showing a lot of electrical activity. So this kind of is one way to, in this case, listen to the brain. This, by the way, is an eye tracker mounted on a pair of glasses. What this allows you to do is know exactly what she's looking at. It would have a forward-facing camera, and it would have a camera that's able to detect where her eye is looking. And so with a device like this, you could, imagine somebody, I guess, in a poker game or something like that. You can literally see everywhere their eye goes. And of course, the eye is kind of leading the mind, right? The eye goes to get information for the mind. That's what the eye kind of does, at least visual information. And so we can kind of track the eyes, which allows us to kind of track the mind. One of of course, the most common devices we use now are something called Fmri, functional magnetic resonance imaging. Magnetic resonance imaging is just a real fancy X-ray. With magnetic resonance imaging, you can get a highly detailed 3D model of something internal, like our brain. In a perfectly healthy, normal person, you can put them in one of these scanners and you can map the brain. So you could have a model of your brain. And then you can kind of take slices too, almost like you were slicing your brain up. So we can, I told you how Broca had to wait for people to die to see that spot on their brain. We don't have to wait for people to die anymore. We can look at anybody's brain at any time and produce a 3D model of it. The Fmri, that F is functional magnetic resonance imaging. What that suggests is that we can actually not just have a 3D model of the brain, but you see how there's different colors here? This is telling you what parts of the brain are active and what parts are suppressed. That's what they've got circled in this case, are the suppressed parts where there's not a lot of activity. How do they do that? Well, they inject radiation into the person, which sounds a little scary. It is a little scary. It's as safe as they can make it, but they literally inject radiation into the person, which goes into their bloodstream. And just like muscles, the brain works like a muscle, that if a certain part of the brain is working hard, it demands a lot of blood because it needs oxygen. So it's pulling in a lot of blood and oxygen. And if we have that blood tagged with radiation, then the radiation comes out of the skull, and that's what this thing is actually measuring, this big round thing that we slide the patient into. It's measuring the radiation as it comes out of the brain. And we can actually now watch the brain in action. We can see where blood is flowing in an active human brain without cutting anybody open. So, it's not perfect. We have what's called not very good temporal resolution. We can only look at big chunks of time. We can't see things millisecond by millisecond yet, but we've come a long way. And because these tools have developed so aggressively, they've really pushed psychology to once again form strong connections with the brain and to understand mind in the context of the brain. So you now hear things like cognitive neuroscience. You won't hear about a cognitive psychologist. I actually am a cognitive psychologist. I'm an old school cognitive psychologist. I was trained during this sort of period. But after I was trained, all of these tools came in. And now the new faculty we hire are people like cognitive neuroscientists or social neuroscientists. So they don't just look at prejudice, but they look at how the brain is reacting to prejudice. So this is sort of where we are in psychology today. Okay, whirlwind history, but we'll reconnect to this history all through the course. I'll kind of bring you back and say, remember this happened? Well, here's where that led to, etc. And so I like to kind of give you all this kind of stuff. The last point I want to kind of make here, because I suggested when Freud started, Freud created this whole other branch of psychology called clinical psychology, and that it was non-scientific. I implied that. And so there was all this scientific reaction to it. Well, those two branches of psychology are largely converging again. That even in the clinical area, there is increased realization that we have to understand the mechanisms that lead to disordered thought. And so this is just a comparison, for example, of non-depressed postpartum subjects in contrast. You can read all the details, but it shows how you can get at something like postpartum depression and actually look to see if there's brain differences between the people who are depressed and are not. And so we can get into connections between mental illness and brain structure, brain chemistry, or I told you we can watch the brain in action, brain action. We can actually see if depressed people, when they think about something, if they use different parts of the brain, etc. And so these areas are coming together, which is really good for clinical psychology. And in fact, one little sort of side story of U of T, for many years, the University of Toronto did not have a clinical psychology group, would not have a clinical psychology group. It was a conscious choice at the University of Toronto that we are science. We are about science, and for many years, clinical psychology did not feel like science. So U of T wanted nothing to do with it. However, because it's become so much more scientific, and because it is so relevant in the world, U of T, and specifically UTSC, right here at Scarborough, we have the first clinical group at U of T, and it's a very strong, powerful group. And we like to think we're leading the way in this term of using scientific approach to address clinical issues. So that's a very kind of hot area generally, and here at UTSC. Okay, so where are we now? Well, just as I kind of describe here, psychology is so broad, and I've given you a taste of some of these things. We are now going to kind of go chapter by chapter and talk about some of these different areas of psychology and some of the interesting findings. We'll worry about how the brain works, but we'll get to things like sexual behavior, social psychology, things like prejudice, clinical things like psychopathy. How does a psychopath act? Just watch CNN, you'll find out all about it, and etc. So we will be going through that. Now, we will be, though, focusing the next chapter on the scientific method. So before we actually get into the guts of various topics, we're going to spend a bit of time on the scientific method because the rest of the course will involve experiments. And so we really want you to understand that experimental approach, how it's used to gain knowledge, etc. And so we'll go into that. All right. But I think otherwise, I've covered all this kind of stuff. So cool. That's it for chapter 1. Now, what's going to happen next time? We'll find out. I'm not ready for Friday yet, but I will be. Alrighty, talk to you soon, guys. Bye-bye.